There we go. Logan the Layman Critic here. Once again, putting on my Layman Gamer hat. And because we're once again in the October season, I figured I'd play another Castlevania game. I had mentioned in a previous video of my Turtles playthrough that I would probably talk about some Dracula films that came out recently, and some other media that's connected in some way. I unfortunately wasn't able to see everything that I wanted to see just because I've been trying to save money. So I did not get around to seeing, what was it, Last Voyage of the Demeter. So I will probably save a review of that movie for a later date. I did, however, get around to seeing Renfield, and I'll go into that as we play. But let's start by talking about this game a little bit. So this game originally came out in October of 1991, if I recall correctly. It was the Japanese title is Akumajo Dracula, and then it was when it came to the U.S. or North America about 2 months later. It was released as Super Castlevania IV. And one of the notable differences between this game in the localized version is that it is retooled as a sequel to Castlevania II. It was initially intended as basically just a retelling of the first game. I'm not sure exactly what the motivation was for making it a sequel in the localized versions, but in any case, I think it works better. The game does not really bear much resemblance to the original game that it's retelling. The level designs are different, the aesthetic is very different, but nevertheless, this game is very good, and that's part of the reason I'm playing it. So I'm going to let this opening crawl finish up, and then we will get on with the game. Another interesting difference between the Japanese version, and the Western release is, you notice that this headstone was destroyed by lightning. So in the Japanese version, there is actually a cross on the top of the headstone, and for the Western release, this was obviously removed because Nintendo had certain policies where they wanted to avoid having any sort of religious imagery or references in their games, so it was censored for the Western release. However, this is Castlevania. It's dealing with iconography relating to Gothic literature, and it's Europe, so obviously a large Christian presence there, so there's really no avoiding having it within the game itself, as you'll notice. All right, let's jump right into it. Look at that. Oh, that's beautiful. This game actually came out, I don't think it was a launch title. Look at that. Wow, the background, that skull, the background, the bats flying out. That's pretty cool. This wasn't a launch title, but it came out, I think, maybe within the first year or two of the SNES. And I have to say, it's, from a technical standpoint, it's very impressive. The Mode 7 scrolling and the different layers. This game looks incredibly advanced when you consider how early in the SNES's life this game was made. Certainly, I would say from a technical standpoint, it's more impressive than the sequel that came out, Dracula X. The graphics in that game are, well, I mean, in all fairness, the style is completely different. This one, I would say, is a little bit more moody, a little bit more grounded in reality, and is much that you can make a fantasy horror style game realistic. The other one seems more anime style, and it works for what it is. I happen to really like Dracula X. I think it's a good game, but uh, I think this game probably does a better job at boasting the capabilities of the SNES. The sprites are larger. Um, the details, it's like very kind of gritty. I mean, you look at the textures on the walls and everything here. I think Dracula X kind of keeps it a little simple, and there's nothing wrong with that. Again, I happen to like Dracula X a lot. I think it's a good game. It's quite underrated in my opinion. But this is a feast for the eyes. I will say that. Okay, so uh, yeah, let's talk about the recent media that has come out uh, this year. As I already mentioned, I did not see Last Voyage of the Demeter, so I won't talk too much about that. Although one one interesting thing that I did notice was that uh, Last Voyage of the Demeter and Renfield, both Dracula films that came out this year, they have something in common, which is that they have some sort of connection to Francis Ford Coppola's film from 1992. Uh, in the case of Renfield, Dracula is being played by Nicolas Cage, who is the nephew of Francis Ford Coppola, part of the Coppola dynasty. And in the case of Demeter, there was some script work done. I don't think he's credited, but my understanding is he was hired to do some polishing on it. James Hart worked on this, helped work on the script for Last Voyage of the Demeter, and of course James Hart wrote the screenplay for Bram Stoker's Dracula. So, just kind of an interesting coincidence that that worked that way. Uh, what's funny to me too is that with in the case of James Hart, he hasn't really done anything of note, but at least that I can think of, uh, since that movie. I mean, he's worked on stuff, but nothing, certainly nothing to the level of success that that film had. The only other movie really that he's done that was kind of remained in the public consciousness was Hook, which is another film that I love, and it's another English classic, Peter Pan. So, uh, I'm eager to see Last Voyage of the Demeter. I know that it did not do well. Neither did Renfield, for that matter. But that's not an indicator of quality. It's just movies. I think in general, it's tough for movies to be successful now because the theater model is not really enduring, unfortunately. I think streaming has done created a lot of damage when it comes to releasing films. You hear different actors, directors kind of lamenting how the movie going experience has been kind of tainted by all these tentpole blockbuster films, superhero films. You can't really have small movies on the big screen anymore. You can't really make small or mid-budget films. Everything has to be made with an enormous budget, and really the industry did that to themselves. Uh, and now everything is more about content, not so much film. And the streaming services are suffering from that, of course, because you just have this influx of, well, first off, all these companies, they decided they saw the success of Netflix with the streaming, and then yeah, Amazon Prime, Hulu. They just said, "Oh, we want in on that." So they started their own individual streaming services. But of course, who wants to pay? I'm trying to think what Netflix is. I think like around $8 a month or something like that. You have all these different services that offer their library, and it's unique to their streaming service rather than just watching it on TV and maybe occasionally catching it while you're channel surfing. Who wants to spend, say, 8, 16, 24, they'll say like $32 on all these different streaming services just to be able to have access to the different variety of programs or films that you might happen to like because they don't all belong to the same studio or company. Eventually, I think it's just going to come back to us having what we did with cable. It's just it'll just be with streaming instead. I hope anyway. I don't know how long it'll take for that bubble to burst. I think we're getting there, particularly with the economy being the way it is. But on the subject of streaming, so the latest uh, season of Castlevania came out, and I have no intention of watching it. uh, I watched the first season, was not terribly impressed. I figured I'd try and give the second season a shot. It was a little bit better, but I still was not terribly happy with it. It was still a lot of the same issues. Uh, Very vulgar. Didn't really care to have much fidelity to the lore. Again, like the first season, maybe not to the same extent, but there was definitely kind of an anti-Christian vibe to it, which sort of flies in the face of the Castlevania games to begin with because it's out God versus Satan, and you have these characters who are kind of uh, chosen by God to go to fight evil and using holy weapons to do that. And just I think the thing that really kind of like turned me off was uh, there was there's this one scene where they're discussing the reason why uh, vampires don't like crosses, and it has something to do with like the the 4 points. It like disorients your vision or some sort of pseudo scientific explanation. It's like, okay, so we're going to take the original reason within the lore, which is like the cross. It's the symbol of Jesus overcoming sin, overcoming death, defeating Satan. We're going to take this powerful imagery as this sort of holy icon, and we're going to change it to it makes vampires get cross-eyed. Like, what? Why are you diluting this interesting piece of lore? Like, even if you're not a Christian, uh, certainly there's you look at something like Helsing, for example. Helsing doesn't necessarily have a whole lot of nice things to say about Christianity as a institution, we'll say, but it keeps the lore, and it's not. I would not say that it's inherently anti-Christian, even though the author is most certainly not. He's from Japan. It's not a common religion there. So I don't know. I mean, I guess it comes down to Warren Ellis. He's a transhumanist. He's not terribly fond of religion, but it just seems weird to me because I remember reading that he he had no prior experience or exposure to Castlevania. The whole appeal of it was that uh, it reminded him of the Hammer films, and he wanted to kind of riff on that with his interpretation. But it's about as far removed from Hammer's work as you could get, because the Hammer films, probably more than any other Dracula interpretation, they're the most probably. I'd go so far as to say probably the most pro-Christian uh, interpretation of the Dracula story than any other. Well, yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, with the possible exception of Coppola's film, um, but that they're heavy on those themes, and I've gone into detail in that with my other video on the Hammer Dracula series. So it's just weird to me. He just kind of missed the point, I think. But of course, he's not even working on the series now. He had that. He ended up suffering the consequences from the whole Me Too thing, and it's he's been replaced by some other writers. But it seems like it's more of the same, from my understanding. I watched I watched a clip of it, or I read some information about the new show, and still the same kind of edge lord middle schooler trying to write fan fiction type of approach, and it's all overly sexed up, uh, more sort of race bending, all this LGBT stuff kind of thrown in there that has had no prior presence within the games themselves. It's all kind of it's the same story, conspicuous diversity kind of thing. And I'll level with you. I don't care about inclusion. Like I don't. Like, insofar as if it wasn't there before, I see no reason to insert it when it was fine without it in its original incarnation. I'm playing this game right now. You know, these games were iconic without any of that stuff in there. So the idea that you need to somehow shoehorn them in there to improve its quality is ridiculous to me. But anyway, my point is, I will not be watching Castlevania Nocturne because it does not seem like a accurate representation of the games, and it's just continuing more of the problems that I had with the previous seasons. And it's always weird to me too, because you'll have you'll have people that defend the series and say, "Oh, it's like, you can't have it's the usual uh reductive reasoning. It's like, "Oh, it's just, Castlevania is a guy who goes to a castle with a whip and fights some monsters, whips Dracula a bunch of times, and then the end." And of course, we all know that that's not the case. We wouldn't be making a Netflix series if we really thought that it was just as simple as that. I mean, you look at all these sort of cultural and historical uh, references that exist within the games. I mean, you saw earlier, while I was playing, you have Simon fighting Medusa, so there's some bit of cultural history there. You're looking at something, Greek mythology. Another thing, obviously Dracula. That's a literary and historical figure. So there's a lot of stuff. Just because the story is simple does not mean that it's shallow. And I think there's also something to be said for having a simplistic story. Um, you look at something like Star Wars. Star Wars is a pretty simple story. I mean, it's about uh, a farm boy who gets pulled into an adventure by an old wise man, and they team up with a pirate to save a princess. And uh, that's the charm of it, right? I mean, it's the hero's journey, which is pretty common across all cultures. Simple story, but also a lot of depth. You think about all the influences that kind of inform Star Wars, its storytelling, its visual aesthetic. You have westerns, Wizard of Oz, you have space opera and samurai films, all these different things kind of thrown into a blender to create this iconic uh, defining piece of entertainment in cinema. It doesn't have to be shallow. It can just be simple. Simplicity is not shallow. And I would also argue, you look at the success of movies like Mortal Kombat, Super Mario Brothers movie, the Sonic the Hedgehog movie. Those are all pretty thin on their premise, but they were all incredibly entertaining, and they worked. They didn't need to be anything. They did not need to modify what they were to be good. In fact, in the case of Super Mario Brothers, you looked at the movie from the '90s where they tried to get away from what those games were. They got away from the simplicity and tried to make it this weird. I don't know what you would even call it, like some sort of fantasy Blade Runner, and it's hot garbage. It did not work at all. So I reject this notion that just because something is simple in its premise, that in some way that you should feel the need to fix what isn't broken. Okay, but let's talk about Renfield. So I have to say that initially when that movie was announced, and I think this was before anybody knew that it was uh, more of a lighthearted approach. I thought it might be an interesting concept to just sort of explore that story from the perspective of that character. And I'll admit that I have a little bit of a soft spot for that character because I played him in a stage production of the show of the book. So that had some appeal to me. And as time went on, we learned that it was going to be not necessarily a comedy, but it was a little bit more lighthearted. It was not sort of a straight horror. I knew that it wasn't going to be a faithful adaptation because this is Dracula and they never do it. So I was sort of cautiously optimistic. And then, of course, Nicolas Cage got cast in it, and I'm like, oh no. Because at this point in his career, I mean, how many decent films has he really made in the last 10, we'll even say last 5 years? The answer is not many. Most of us know that. Although he did do that film with Pedro Pascal, which I have not seen it for myself, but I've heard is quite entertaining. So there's the news of him getting cast, which did not inspire much confidence, and then you saw some behind the scenes photos. Like I think they were uh, just like candid, so they weren't official photographs, and he just kind of looked really, really silly. So I did not have high hopes after a while. So I figured, okay, well, this is just. I probably won't watch this. I'll probably hear about how terrible it is. But then the movie came out, and I heard from a couple people that it was really entertaining. So I thought, okay, well, let's give this a shot. I watched some previews for it. It's like, okay, yeah, this might be worth giving a watch. It might not be great, but there might be some saving graces for it. I mean, I like Nicholas Hoult; he's a good actor. Did a great job in Jack the Giant Slayer and um, Warm Bodies, and of course the X-Men films. So we'll see. So I finally got around to watching it, and uh, yeah, it's actually it's quite fun. I think that it it was an interesting variation on the story. I think that again, taking the perspective of the Renfield character was something fresh and new. I think it was exactly the kind of thing that this this sort of world needed to explore. Um, and I liked the angle of him sort of using the bugs as a means of kind of getting supercharged. I cannot think of any other incarnation that has done that before. So that was kind of new. The fight choreography and stuff, it's very much like it kind of has that Matrix flavor, I guess you could say. Very stylized. So that was kind of interesting. Um, and for the most part, they kept to the lore, although they really, again, this is the world we live in. You have the Dracula character who is sort of the embodiment of evil, who is ultimately destroyed by the power of God, but his his uh his weakness to the cross, to the power of God, it's sort of given a cursory mention without actually being applied. In fact, I think he's he's placed in this protective circle where he's immobilized, where they finally do him in, and that's a reference to the novel because Van Helsing creates with this thing called a holy circle, and it's I think it's he breaks up pieces of a consecrated bread. Uh, in this case, they say it's something related to Wicca. It's like, oh, okay, well, we're gonna rob this of its any sort of connection to Christianity. It's like, okay, whatever. So, I at this point, I'm not really terribly surprised that it's been a long time coming where they've robbed the Dracula story, the Dracula lore of any of its uh, Christian underpinnings, which is kind of sad. Not just because I'm a religious person, but also because it's an inherent part of the identity of that book. You know, with all the with all the talk about uh, analyzing Stoker's novel, everything always kind of comes down to sexual subtext, which, as I've mentioned in the past, is overstated. And anything that exists in the book is explicitly there, which is to say, there's not much of that. But the religious component of it, the religious significance of it, is explicit. And it's more than just a little bit within the book itself. So I think that as time goes on, we're going to see less and less of the religious significance of the symbolism and the themes within that book. It's going to become less and less uh, a core part of the story, and it's going to just become less Dracula. But moving on from that, uh, I will say that with Nicolas Cage, I was pleasantly surprised at, at the job that he did. It was not overly hammy. Uh, it's definitely he's chewing the scenery. There's no question about that. But at the same time, it does not. He's not acting bad. Like his acting is. It's not cheesy. It's it's the right amount of melodrama, I guess you could say. And it's a lot of fun. He seems like he's having a great time. It made me want to see him do it to play the character in a completely straight interpretation. Now, I don't think that'll happen. Like Last Voyage of the Demeter, Renfield did not make money. It was a big old flop. And so I think that'll probably discourage him from pursuing anything like that again, unless he really needs some money, which in Nicolas Cage's case, that might actually be true. Trying to think anything else of note. Something else that was kind of strange to me for being a vampire film is that there actually aren't that many. So usually the thing with Dracula is, he wants to create more. He'll find a woman that he's infatuated with and be possessive of her and want to make her his bride. But you don't really get that here. He doesn't actually make any more vampires in it. He does create slaves that are super powerful with all the. Okay, spoiler alert, just in case. Speed ahead about 15 seconds if you don't want to hear this. A bunch of gangsters he turns into his slaves, and they have the powers just like Renfield. But other than that, no, he doesn't do anything. He doesn't create any other vampires. Here's a neat little detail here that I love that they worked in the game. Okay, you see this little ghost dog here. I'm gonna take him out. Look, his owner drops his lantern, sits by the dog, and starts weeping before he fades away. Really kind of cool detail. I like these little hidden rooms. You won't find anything kind of anything of that sort of, I don't even know what you would call it, emotional subtlety in the Netflix show, unfortunately. Another thing with the Renfield film that I found to be, yes, off-putting. A lot of cursing. Uh, like excessively so. As I've said before, I'm not prudish about that sort of thing, but I do feel like at some point it sort of loses any effectiveness. It's not good writing. I it's gotten worse and worse as the years have gone on. You think of a movie like Wolf of Wall Street, like, gosh, it's like I never even bothered to watch. I'm not a huge fan of Martin Scorsese anyway. He's a good filmmaker, don't get me wrong, but most of his films I don't find particularly appealing. Um, the Aviator was great. Taxi Driver's pretty good. I'm trying to think of what else I like of his. Anyway, yeah, it's just this excessive use of throwing f-bombs and stuff like that. And it's just like, okay, well, at some point, I would compare it if you want to compare it in terms of writing. It's using a exclamation point over and over and over again in your writing when a simple period will suffice. After a while, that exclamation point kind of loses its effectiveness in your writing. So that's my opinion on that. And in films in general, that I think that they are excessive in their use of cursing. I think that they could do to moderate themselves and find more creative ways of constructing their dialogue. I think it's kind of lazy, especially when it comes to comedy. And I'm trying to think, what else do I have to say about Renfield? Um, oh, yeah, there was one other thing that my brother actually pointed this out to me, and I probably wouldn't have thought anything of it. But so there's a scene where you sort of see how Renfield came to be in the thrall of Dracula, and they're showing this old black and white footage, and it's echoing the 1931 film with Bela Lugosi. My brother pointed out to me that he thought that the actors were their heads were digitally placed over the original actors, Dwight Frye, Bela Lugosi. Um, at the time, I had not seen the film, so I couldn't confirm that. But once I watched it, I'm like, oh yeah, yeah, that's exactly what they did. And so the film is sort of kind of a sequel to that movie, although I think that the tone and the lore don't really follow from that movie. So it's sort of a loose sequel. I mean, don't let that keep you from enjoying it. But yeah, just kind of a fun little homage. Never know how that's pronounced. Uh, to the 31 film. Like I can't really imagine Bela Lugosi doing the stuff that that Nicolas Cage's interpretation would do. So dancing ghosts. And let's see here. I had mentioned in my Turtles video that I would also talk about the BBC adaptation that came out. Gosh, wait, is that? I think it was 2019. And I had also mentioned how it was awful, and it was. I I was really hoping uh, that it would be good, just from the talent involved, because it had the guys that were involved with the more recent uh, adaptation of Sherlock Holmes, the one with uh, Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman. And though I really liked that show, I thought it was cool that they modernized the Sherlock character. They were able to take the stories and put them in a new context. Now, I will be um, give you full disclosure, and I've not read the Sherlock Holmes stories, so I don't necessarily have the same level of investment as far as the fidelity to the source material because I don't know enough about them. But I liked the acting. I liked the stories. I thought it was cool. Some Sherlock fans maybe wouldn't care for the changes that made. My mom's a huge Sherlock fan. She loved that show. So yeah, hearing that those the that creative team was involved with making this Dracula adaptation had me interested and had me optimistic. And I thought, oh, well, maybe they'll put it in the modern day, and we'll get a unique adaptation of the book. Well, it was definitely unique, but that does not mean that it was good. um, I think uh, I think for starters, um, they they made some really weird changes. Like for starters, I keep reusing that. I apologize. Um, Dracula's very gay. Now, I remember the writers saying that he's not really. That's not really true. It's just more like he's sort of an equal opportunity killer. But that's not the vibe that you get from the actor, from the performance. And my thought is like that's about as far from Dracula as you can get. And look, I know that there are interpretations of parts of the book where uh, people say that there's sort of a gay subtext in Dracula, and those people are wrong, because if you look at Bram Stoker's background, that he would not have written a scene like that, and if he had, it certainly wouldn't have been in a positive context. I mean, this was a devoted Anglican, so they would have been he and the church would have been vehemently opposed to anything like that. Um, so it was just weird to me that they kind of have that, and not even just with Dracula, but like Van Helsing, who they've gender bent, and it just goes off in a totally different direction. Like it starts off kind of adapting the book, and then it goes into, so Dracula somehow ends up in the present day, and then you have, I don't know, it's such a mess, and it's not fun. Like the best thing I can compare it to is like getting your teeth pulled trying to watch that show. And the only reason I even finished it was because I wanted to know how it ended, because it wasn't good. I didn't like the guy who played Dracula. Again, talking about the lore, the any sort of religious component is just sort of treated with very minor consideration. So like the the use of the cross works because a person, because of the power of belief, not because it's true. Um, and that just rings hollow for me. I stood up too soon. I just It was weird for me that you know in this group of people that were making a Dracula adaptation, you know, their their thought process is like, okay, well, let's bring Dracula into the 21st century. What can we do that'll make this adaptation different from every other adaptation? Let's make him gay. Like, what? No, that's not Dracula. Like, he embodies sexuality. Like, well, I should say the film Dracula, not the book. Again, talking about Um, but it's just, I don't know. Yeah. Ugh. I will never watch. I will never rewatch that again. I can't stomach it. It's just the story, the casting, just not great. There was one cool thing I remember where I think he turned into a I think he turned into a wolf, and then his method of changing back is basically he just kind of like tore out he like tore out of the wolf body that he changed into, and it was like a cocoon. It was just weird, this weird imagery. It kind of made me think of The Thing, but that's about the only positive thing I have to say about that miniseries show, whatever you want to call it. Well, hard for me to believe it, but I actually ran out of things to say. But I'm having a good time playing this, so we're gonna keep pushing through, and I will find some new stuff to discuss. Uh, you know, I've wanted to talk about Vampire Hunter D. I've mentioned it in passing before, and I almost recorded a podcast about it a couple years ago, but I wasn't happy with the results, so I kind of scrapped it because it felt a little bit too unorganized. And in this case, it might not be any different, but because I'm just kind of riffing right now. But uh, if you've watched my channel, which I'm assuming you probably have, if you're watching this, I have a great love for anime, but that was not always the case. And I think the first step to bringing me towards my love of anime was seeing Vampire Hunter D. And I watched that. When did I watch that? It had to have been in probably 2000, 2001. Um, and I learned of it through Castlevania, because there's always the comparison that between the two, um, that, that and there's a lot of speculation that Vampire Hunter D inspired Castlevania, which I think is true. There's a lot of similarities, um, but I read about it at the Castlevania dungeon. There was an article that discussed the comparisons, and as I mentioned, I did not really like anime at this point in time. My perception of it was that it was either too silly or just kind of too edgy for its own sake. Um, I at the time, I had been exposed to stuff like Sailor Moon, Pokemon, Dragon Ball Z, and in the case of the latter two, I kind of got burnt out on them because they oversaturated my world. So I was like, okay, nope, not interested because people won't shut up about it. So, but I was willing to give this a shot because like, oh, it's like basically a Castlevania anime. This is like the closest I'll ever get to like a movie or a show of Castlevania. I guess I was wrong. But so I remember I was at Media Play. I don't know if you guys remember that store. It was pretty big. They sold books, CDs, movies, video games. Pretty big store for, I'm going to say probably a decade, maybe longer. And I was browsing, and I saw that. I saw Vampire Hunter D, and I saw Scars of Dracula, both of which I really, really wanted because Scars of Dracula, I'd never seen it on tape before. Really, the only Hammer films in that series that I had seen at that point were um, Horror of Dracula and Dracula Prince of Darkness. So as soon as I saw that, I picked them up and I booked for the counter to buy it. And I remember, I think that was on a Saturday night. I watched. I watched Vampire Hunter D for the first time, and I was blown away by it. Um, the atmosphere. I love the voice acting. Uh, I miss Streamline Pictures. And I wasn't there to experience their output during their heyday, but there is something there's something truly special there. And I know a lot of people kind of give Carl Masick flack because his adaptations were not always the most faithful, and he wasn't really a big fan of distributing films in subtitles. You also have to understand at the time that that was really not a viable business model. Most people probably wouldn't, anime fans probably wouldn't have bought movies in subtitles because most people didn't watch movies in subtitles. So I'll give Masick a pass on that one because we got a lot of good anime out of it from Streamline. They get the dub for Akira, my favorite anime, one of my favorite films. Uh, Wicked City, Lily Cat, Golgo 13, Kashan, Fist of the North Star. I mean, there's the list goes on. But anyway, yeah, I love the dub for Vampire Hunter D. And again, we're talking about a story that's pretty simple. Girl gets bitten by a vampire. She comes across a hunter, hires him to slay the vampire. She gets kidnapped. He has to rescue her. And um, and as I said before, something simple does not have to be shallow. Um, this film is playing on a variety of different genres. Darn it. Obviously, horror, and science fiction, fantasy, and the western. Uh, it's this D is he's the gunslinger, but with a sword, and he's out to take out the bad guy that's threatening the town. Comes in on a horse and everything. Even the ending is kind of similar to Shane. He's that the titular character is riding off away from the town, and then the little boy is shouting Shane, Shane. You know, uh, there's something very similar in Vampire Hunter D when he's riding his horse out of town. Doris and Dan, I think it's Dan. They're both shouting to D, you know, wishing him well and everything. So yeah, Vampire Hunter D. I there we go. Thank you. Normally it does not take me that long, just to be clear. It's because I'm talking. Um, I also like the sequel, Bloodlust. I don't like it as much. Not because it's of poor quality. If anything, I would think a fair case could be made that it is a better film. But I like I like the story for the first one much better. And also, I would say that it's a better adaptation. It's a more faithful adaptation of the novel, of the first novel. Um, Bloodlust is an adaptation of the third book, Demon Death Chase, and it takes quite quite a few liberties. Um, some of which I like, others I'm not so crazy about. But the animation in it is gorgeous. Uh, Kawajiri, that's the director. Why am I forgetting his what is his first name? It's escaping me right now. I apologize. But yeah, I mean that guy has done has done some incredible anime, and uh, relatively speaking to the other works that he's done, this one's much more tame, especially when you compare it to something like Wicked City. But is it Shinji Kawabiri? Anyway, uh, that one's a lot of fun. I highly recommend both, and I'm really surprised that they have taken so long to get a new adaptation going. It's been it's got to be at least 20 years now at this point. But and what's his name? Hideyoki Kikuchi. He's been writing stories for that character for no since at least since the 80s, and I don't think he has any plans of stopping. So it's not like there's any shortage of material for them to use if they want to make another movie. I know there was talk about them doing a show, and that might work, but I think I'd rather just have a movie because at least then you can allocate all that money towards having a more visually pleasing uh, animation, like Bloodlust. It's funny playing through this level. It kind of makes me think of the Cave of Wonders because you have all these treasures on the ground and everything. It's fun. I love that ghost effect that you had scrolling through. One of the neat things in this game too is like certain scrolling effects. If you even if you're pressing pause, they keep going, which that's not unusual for a Konami game. I think even in the NES games like Turtles 2, you play like the first level, you get the apartment building that's on fire. You press pause, and the flames are still going. But there's a neat secret in this level, and nobody ever talks about it. And I think, well, the only reason I know about it is because there was actually I still have it back home. Uh, there was this guide to Super Nintendo games, and this happened to be one of them. This is actually how I even first heard of Castlevania, because I used to look at the pictures of it all the time. And there is these treasure chests that I'm walking across. There's a trick where if you jump on them a certain number of times, it's like I can't remember. I think it's like almost like 90 times or something crazy like that. You'll get a pork chop or roast chicken or whatever it is, which are not terribly common in this level. But that's a neat little secret if you're kind of new to this game and you're struggling through it, especially if you're playing it through the second run where it's much harder. But I never hear anybody talk about it. The only time I've ever even seen it is in that guide. So if you happen to work on the Castlevania wiki, or you're a member of the dungeon, feel free to share it with them. I wish I could remember the number. I'd have the number of times you have to jump, but uh, yeah, neat little secret. The background here kind of looks like potatoes. I have no idea if any of you who are going to watch this are going to comment on it. Excuse me. But I'd like to get your opinion. Do you think this game serves better as a sequel or as a retelling of the first game? In my personal opinion, I think I prefer it as a sequel, um, primarily because the second game ends in such a way that it's it is a hook leading directly into Dracula coming back. His hand comes up out of the grave. Not only that, but the gravestone is the same as the one that appears in the beginning of this game, or at least in the Japanese version, because it has a cross on the top. And you know, and I like Simon. He's my favorite. He's my favorite Castlevania character, other than uh, maybe with the exception of Trevor. Well, actually, it's a tough call. I like Richter a lot too. Really, I prefer. Well, okay, so let me finish what I was gonna say. Yeah, do you prefer this as a sequel or as a retelling? So my vote is for sequel. I'd like to hear your thoughts and why. So please feel free to comment about it. Give me your opinion. I'd like to hear it. Um, but to talk about this game a little bit more for a second, this this game has a lot of unique features, particularly for its time, because uh, probably up until Symphony of the Night, some of the the game mechanics in this were not repeated. So the multi-directional whipping, that was a new feature for this game, and um, it added a new element to the platforming, like being able to swing across chasms and stuff like that. Even something like this, like where I'm letting the whip go slack, and I can use it to take out enemies below me, above me. It added a new gameplay strategy, which is really fun and cool. Butter knife. Um, the next game that came out for the Super Nintendo, Dracula X, it forgoes that entirely. It's just the typical left and right. You don't even get a diagonal. Now the Sega Genesis game Bloodlines, it offers you the ability to do a diagonal if you want to. For example, if you want to swing across gaps and stuff. But that's about it. And it's a little bit tricky to pull off. It's not. I don't think the controls for Bloodlines are as strong. It's a little bit too much like the NES games, a little too stiff. That being said, Bloodlines is a very good game, and I highly recommend it. And it's probably. I think that game and Dracula X, they're good successors to the NES trilogy. Um, in terms of gameplay, I think this game is a good evolution from the three games, and I I like them all. I mean, they're all good in their own ways, but I feel like this game from the 16-bit era, I think it's the best one with regards to kind of uh, innovation. Uh, I think the advantage that Bloodlines and Dracula X, or more specifically Rondo of Blood, um, what they have is that their storyline is a little bit more, it has a little bit more depth to it. With Rondo of Blood, you've got they started implementing cutscenes, kind of crude animation. You have multiple paths that you can take, which is kind of a takeaway from Castlevania III. Uh, got different characters that you can interact with, different characters you can play too, because you can play Maria as well in Rondo. Dracula X or Dracula Double X if you're playing it in Japan. Um, it strips down the gameplay from Rondo, and uh, a lot of people don't like it. A lot of people kind of unfairly compare it to, well, maybe not unfairly compare it to Rondo, but because again, it's a stripped down version of that game. I think people probably wouldn't be so quick to criticize it if we had actually gotten Rondo here in the West. It was not. We were long denied that game for many years until they did a re. I guess it'd be like a remaster for PSP. But um, if it had come out at the time, I think people would have been fine. You know, Dracula X or Dracula Double X, if you want to call it that. It's really, again, it's kind of a similar situation to this game in that it's sort of a sequel, sort of a retelling. But in this case, in Japan, it's it's kind of a sequel. But really, I guess a better way to put it is it's kind of like DLC before we had DLC. So it's the same story, but it kind of the completes Rondo because Rondo ends in a cliffhanger. Dracula's defeated by Richter, but then he retreats, and the castle's still standing. In the case of the follow-up, he is destroyed. Oh, come on, no! Ah, what is with me today? And honestly, I think it would be cool. It'll never happen. This is me just kind of having a pipe dream. It'd be cool to have Rondo and Dracula X just kind of made into one big game. Like you play through Rondo, you know, you get the ending, and then the game starts over, and you got these whole other paths you have to do. Characters you have to rescue over again. Maybe implement some of the game mechanics from one another. Um, Even though I think Rondo, because that's from the piece for the PC engine. I'm not sure if they used CD. Yeah, they did use CD. So they probably had something like Redbook audio. Even though arguably the music should sound better, I I actually prefer the SNES music to Dracula X. I don't know if it's just the synthesizers that they use or what it is, but I prefer that rendition. All right, we're almost there. I like these pirates. I think they're pirates. Look like they got rapiers, so I'm gonna say they're pirates. See, that's a cool little effect. And we didn't get that again until I think it's 1997. Symphony of the Night came out. You can play Richter once you've beaten the game, or you have the Sega Saturn version, which allows you to play any of the characters from the beginning. Playing Richter in Symphony of the Night is pretty fun. I gotta admit, I've never played the Saturn version. You can actually play as Maria in the game, if I'm not mistaken, and I've heard it's not as good as the PlayStation version. I think there's some issues with like the controls or something like that. But I would like to try it someday. I think the PSP version actually implements a lot of the stuff from the Sega Saturn version. Golems. Stone golems. One of the neat things I think when this game was localized, I normally wouldn't say this about Konami of America because a lot of the time when they localize these games, they didn't really take it too seriously. Um, they'd have a lot of inside jokes in the manuals and things like that. Uh, so like a perfect example is, you saw the floating horse heads earlier, and in the manual they're referred to as Mr. Head, as in Mr. Ed. If you have no idea what that is, Mr. Ed was a old television show. I think it was in the '60s, maybe, uh, about a horse that could talk. So Mr. Head, Mr. Ed. Yeah. But like the bosses, they gave them when they localized them in the manual here in the U.S. They gave them new names. So like the stone golem that I fought, the one that was huge and then shrunk down over time, they gave him the name Coronat, uh, which is really just an anagram for ton of rock. Um, the other one is the skeleton on the horse, uh, Rodane. It's kind of like rode in, on a horse. There's another one. What was it? Pewixel in reverse is licks you up because it's a giant skull with a tongue that licks at you. Um, no, don't. I hate this boss, Slagora. You're gonna get demoted to being a regular bad guy in Symphony of the Night. Enjoy your glory while you have it. Uh, yeah, enjoy it. I need it. I need the cross. Just let me focus here. Almost got him. Come on, no. I mentioned in passing Helsing. Uh, that's a great show. Uh, really cool premise. It's basically it kind of twists the ending for the original Dracula novel. It's like, well, instead of getting killed, what if uh, Professor Van Helsing subdued Dracula in such a way that he was kind of forced to be under the servitude of Van Helsing's family. And over time, he's just kind of sealed away, and then the youngest living descendant of the Van Helsing family, which has now just become Helsing, um, uh, becomes the master, and she accidentally frees him, and he's awesome. He's a vampire that loves to kill vampires because he's sort of obsessed with bloodshed. He's not a good guy, just to be clear. Even though he helps the good guys, he is not a good guy. But he's utterly charismatic, and I tip my hat to Crispin Freeman for phenomenal performance of that character, and really all the cast. I like both versions of the show. You have the initial release, which is I think like 13, 14 episodes, something like that, and and then you had Hellsing Ultimate, which was a series of OVAs, which are true faithful adaptations of the manga, because at the time the original show was actually being made concurrently with the manga, so they kind of went off in their own direction after a while, and they ended things. Um, the animation is of a higher quality, I would say, for the OVAs, and as I mentioned before, it is more faithful to the manga. However, I think I prefer the series. The music, for starters, is really cool. Kind of a, I don't know if I'd say jazzy, but it's got a very distinctive style to it, and uh, it's not like any other kind of uh, like vampire sort of action series. I The Hellsing Ultimate does not have that in the music. It sort of lacks the style of the first show. To the credit of those involved, I think in both the Japanese and English cast, they retained the the cast from the first rendition, which is very rare. There might be like one or two actors who were replaced, although if that's the case, I wouldn't know. They do. My guess is if there are replacements, they're not anybody that is sorely missed. I think the thing that I don't care as much with the show not being faithful to the manga, because I didn't really like the direction that the manga went. You had Here's a secret. Um, with the manga, you kind of have this whole neo-Nazi thing. They're creating vampires, and I think the main bad guy, I think he's like a cyborg or something like that. It just gets really weird, and I just I did not like the direction they went. Um, as much as the villain of the series, the 13 episode series, Incognito, as much as he's kind of bland, I still think he's infinitely more preferable to Montana Max, which, by the way, is the name of a character from Tiny Toon Adventures. I do not know why they went. I think that's his fan name. I don't think he ever actually has an official name, but for some reason they used that one. So here we are at Dracula. I think something is lost when you get the beam announcing where he's teleporting. I think that you kind of take away some of the challenge by having that there. Come on. Okay. Wow, I actually got a game over. I can't believe that. So this is what happens when I'm talking while I'm playing. My gameplay suffers. Just imagine if the music was playing. Although, my first playthrough that I ever did on here, I did pretty well. I only died once. Didn't get any game overs. So maybe it's just maybe it's just some bad luck. Because I've been playing this game for probably the past 2 weeks to get myself ready for this video. And I've done much better in some plays. My last play I didn't do as well. So come on, get the chicken, get the chicken. I saw a funny comic the other day. It was mentioning with Castlevania. It's like the architect was building the castle for Dracula. He's got some he's got some meat hidden in the wall. And I think the architect says something, or the mason, whatever. It's like, are you sure you just don't? Are you sure you don't want like a meat locker instead? So come on. All right, here we go. Moment of truth. I do love the design of this throne room. I do think, however, that his final form is a little bit of a letdown. I mean, it's just a skull. I mean, compared to what we've had in the past. So close. So close. All right, here's another thing that I've been trying to figure out, because I've been looking at Simon's armor, and I cannot come up with a definitive answer. His armor, depending on when I'm looking at it, his armor either looks kind of a bluish green or green, and then other times it looks like it's gray. What do you guys think? Because like right now, it kind of looks like a kind of a blue-green, but then like the beginning of the game when he enters the gates, it looks kind of gray. And then in the ending, it kind of looks green again. I don't know. Give me your thoughts. Almost there. Come on, let's speed through this. That's probably the worst thing I could say right now. Come on. Come on, come on. Here we go. Here we go. Let's try and get it right this time. Being a little bit too careless, that's my problem. Almost there. 2 more hits. There we go. 1 more hit. And then changes back for some reason. No! Why did they use the sunlight? That's not in the book. That will never not be a pet peeve for me. I'm sorry. If there's any argument for making this not canon, it's for this part right here. Although I don't know why the glass breaks. Maybe it's God's light shining down. Maybe it's not really the sun. Maybe it's holiness pouring on and taking him to the void. Yeah. There we go. That's my headcanon. All right. That's pretty cool. Okay, so you look here, kind of looks green. Doesn't look gray. Look at that. I do love the music at the end of this. It makes me very nostalgic, even though I never had the pleasure of playing this in the 90s. I discovered it through the wonderful world of emulation before finally getting a copy of it for myself. But yeah, it's games like these that make me long for the 90s, which I never thought I would say. I mean, well, I mean the 90s wasn't that bad. You know, putting aside stuff like political correctness and Bill Clinton's shenanigans, there's still a lot of cool stuff. You know, I like some of the music. We had some pretty cool TV shows, a lot of cheesy stuff. I guess it's a bit like the 80s. Anyway, we're at the end of the game, and thanks for coming out to listen to this, and I hope you guys have a happy Halloween. Be safe, and take care, and God bless.